Picture this. A king enters his temple in triumph. But his chariot isn't pulled by horses. It's pulled by 5 conquered kings on their hands and knees. Behind him walk prisoners, each wearing the severed head of a rebellious prince around their neck like a grotesque necklace. This wasn't fiction. This was Tuesday in the Assyrian Empire, the world's first superpower and the most terrifying government humanity had ever created. For 300 years, they perfected the art of conquest. Then, in just 20 years, they vanished so completely that their enemies burned every trace. Almost. This is the story of how an empire built on blood drowned in it. Long before they became the ancient world's nightmare, the Assyrians were just merchants. Shrewd traders, yes, but not conquerors. Not yet. Their story begins not with war, but with climate catastrophe. In the 3rd millennium BC, the Arabian Peninsula wasn't the desert you know today. It was savanna, green, fertile, alive with grazing animals and scattered settlements. Rainfall was regular, rivers flowed, life thrived. But around 2500 BC, something shifted in the global climate patterns. The rain stopped falling with the same regularity. Year by year, decade by decade, the grasslands withered. What had been fertile savanna transformed into the arid wasteland we recognize today. And entire peoples had to make an impossible choice: move or die. The Semitic tribes who would become the Assyrians chose to move. They fled north in waves, crossing into Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This wasn't empty territory. The Sumerians had already built sophisticated city-states in the south. But there was room in the north, along the middle course of the Tigris. And that's where these climate refugees settled, building cities with names that would echo through history. Nineveh, Arbela, and most importantly, Ashur. But these weren't independent kingdoms at first, far from it. They were vassals, subjects of more powerful southern states. The cities of these proto-Assyrians fell under the control of Sargon the Great's Akkadian Empire, then Hammurabi's Babylonian Empire, and various other dominant Mesopotamian powers. For centuries, they existed in the shadow of greater civilizations, paying tribute, following orders, surviving. Here's where geography becomes destiny. The city of Ashur sat on the most valuable real estate in the ancient world, the trade route connecting lower Mesopotamia to Anatolia. Think of it as controlling the ancient equivalent of the Suez Canal or the Strait of Malacca. Every caravan traveling between the wealthy cities of Babylon and the resource-rich kingdoms of Anatolia had to pass through or near Ashur. The location was strategic perfection. Merchants from Ashur didn't just facilitate this trade, they dominated it. They established trading colonies and outposts throughout Anatolia. The largest of these was Karam Kanesh, a thriving commercial settlement that became a hub of international commerce. Assyrian traders transported precious goods in both directions. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, tin from the Iranian plateau, and copper from Babylonia flowed westward. Timber for construction, woolen textiles, silver and gold flowed eastward, and Ashur grew extraordinarily wealthy on the profits. The wealth was transformative. By the 19th century BC, Ashur had accumulated enough economic power to do something audacious and unprecedented. They declared independence from Babylon. There was no great war, no dramatic conquest, no legendary battle. Just a quiet commercial power saying, "We don't need you anymore. We're independent now." And they had enough wealth to make it stick. But here's what made them unique, what set them apart from every other trading city in the ancient world. The city wasn't simply named after its god, a common practice in Mesopotamia. The god was the city. Ashur, the name, meant both the divine protector and the physical rock beneath their feet, the limestone foundation upon which the city was built. To an Assyrian, there was no separation between the civic and the civic. The city was the god's physical body. The walls were his skin. The people were his blood. This wasn't just religious devotion, this was identity fusion at a level that would shape everything they became.
Early Ashur wasn't even a kingdom in the traditional sense. Think about this. They considered their true king to be the god Ashur himself. The human ruler, he was just a manager, a representative, an earthly administrator of divine will. His official title reflected this. He wasn't called king, but rather something closer to governor or steward. And his power was remarkably limited for a Bronze Age ruler. Two institutions checked his authority. First, a council of the city's elders, wealthy merchants and landowners who had real political power, not just advisory roles. Second, and even more interesting, was an official called the Limu. This position was elected for a one-year term, and the Limu served as both the head of the city council and the chief financial officer. Any major decision made by the governor required formal approval from the council. And funding? That had to be secured through the Limu, who controlled the budget. It was almost democratic, at least by Bronze Age standards. For a society in 1900 BC, this was remarkably restrained governance. But here's the brutal truth about the ancient world. Restraint doesn't build empires. Wealth without military power is just wealth waiting to be taken. And the Assyrians learned this lesson the hard way. In the 18th and 17th centuries BC, peace and stability in Anatolia began to collapse. Internal wars erupted. Regional powers fought for dominance. Trade routes became dangerous. Assyrian colonies like Karum Kanesh were attacked, looted, and eventually destroyed. The commercial network that had made Ashur wealthy disintegrated. Trade declined precipitously. And without trade revenue, Ashur's economic power evaporated. The result was predictable and devastating. Ashur fell back under Babylonian control. The brief period of independence was over. They were vassals again, subjects, tributaries. Then it got worse. In the 16th century BC, the region became a battleground. Babylonians and Hittites clashed in fierce, destructive conflicts that culminated in the shocking capture and looting of Babylon itself in 1531 BC. Soon after, Kassite tribes migrated from the Iranian plateau into Mesopotamia and established several kingdoms. The most powerful of these was Mitanni. And Mitanni wanted control over the trade routes, the same routes that ran through Ashur. For nearly 2 centuries, Ashur remained a vassal of Mitanni. The city was nominally independent, but that independence was a fiction. Mitanni's command was absolute. Ashur's fortifications were demolished, leaving the city defenseless and exposed. Representatives from Mitanni sat on Ashur's city council, ensuring that no major decisions were made without Mitanni approval. It was occupation in all but name. Little is known about this dark period in Assyrian history. The records are sparse, the details fragmentary. But we do know one crucial thing. The Assyrians were learning. They adopted significant military and technological innovations from their Mitanni overlords, the light war chariot, the composite bow, and lamellar armor. These weren't just weapons. They were the future of warfare. And the Assyrians, patient and pragmatic, absorbed every lesson. They were vassals, they were occupied, they were humiliated, but they were watching, learning, and waiting for their moment. If you're hooked on this story of how a merchant city transformed into a military machine, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It helps this channel reach history lovers everywhere. Now, let's talk about how they finally broke free and what happened when they did.
In the 15th century BC, everything changed for Assyria. And it started with something that seems small, but was actually revolutionary: a wall. King Ashur-bel-nisheshu made a decision that would echo through history. He ordered the reconstruction of Ashur's defensive walls. Now, in the Bronze Age Near East, this wasn't just a construction project. This was a declaration of war. Fortified walls meant you didn't accept anyone's authority. They were a physical statement. We defend ourselves. We answer to no one. We are sovereign. The Mitanni, who technically ruled Ashur and had explicitly demolished those very walls to keep the city vulnerable, should have crushed this rebellion immediately and decisively. But they didn't. And the reason reveals something crucial about power in the ancient world.
Internal conflict destroys empires faster than external enemies. Mitanni was tearing itself apart in civil strife, different factions fighting for control. They were too preoccupied with their own survival to notice or care what was happening in a distant vassal city. The Assyrians, masters of patience and timing, seized that moment of weakness with both hands. King Ashur-uballit I went even further than his predecessor. He didn't just rebuild walls, he expelled Mitanni diplomats from the city, a shocking breach of protocol. Then he declared himself king. Not governor, not representative, not steward, king. The word itself was a revolution. But Ashur-uballit didn't stop there. He did something brilliant, something that showed sophisticated understanding of international politics. He sent envoys to Egypt, Mitanni's greatest rival and enemy, asking for recognition as an independent ruler. The Egyptian pharaoh, delighted to see Mitanni weakened, agreed. He recognized Assyria as an independent state. And just like that, with diplomatic recognition from the ancient world's other superpower, Assyria was reborn as a sovereign state. The Babylonian king was absolutely furious. He wrote an angry letter to the Egyptian pharaoh, a letter that survives to this day on clay tablets, essentially saying, "Those are my vassals you're talking to. How dare you recognize them?" The pharaoh ignored him completely, because by then the balance of power had already shifted. Assyria was no longer a vassal anyone could push around. But here's what made Assyria fundamentally different from every other rising power in the ancient Near East. They didn't just want independence, they didn't just want security, they wanted to reshape reality itself according to a divine blueprint. Under King Adad-nirari I, Assyrian political ideology underwent a transformation that would echo through every empire that followed for the next 3,000 years. The Assyrians stopped seeing themselves as a city-state among other city-states. They were now a territorial empire with a manifest destiny. The very language changed. It was no longer just Ashur the city, but Mot Ashur, the land of Ashur, a realm that could and should stretch as far as Assyrian boots could march.
The kings stopped calling themselves King of Assyria. That title was too limiting, too provincial, too modest. They were now King of the universe, King of the totality of all, King of the four corners of the world. And this wasn't mere arrogance or royal bombast, though it was certainly those things too. This was theological conviction. They genuinely believed it with religious fervor. Here was the logic, and you have to understand this to understand everything that follows. Ashur, the god, was the source of all cosmic order in the universe. Assyria, the state, was the physical embodiment of divine law and heavenly order on earth. Everything outside Assyria's borders, that was chaos, darkness, disorder, a violation of the natural order of creation itself. So when Assyrian armies invaded neighboring kingdoms, slaughtered their soldiers, and subjugated their peoples, they weren't just conquering in the normal sense. They were performing a sacred duty, fulfilling a divine mandate. They were bringing order to chaos, civilization to barbarism, the light of Ashur to the benighted masses stumbling in darkness. Any resistance to Assyrian conquest wasn't political opposition or legitimate self-defense. It was blasphemy. It was a crime against the universe itself, against the fundamental structure of reality itself. This is where empire becomes truly dangerous, when conquest transforms from political ambition to religious obligation, when expansion becomes a sacred duty that cannot be questioned. The Assyrians systematically elevated Ashur from a city patron god, one deity among many in the Mesopotamian pantheon, to the supreme deity above all others. If Ashur was the god of gods, the king of the divine realm, then logically, inevitably, the king of Assyria must be the king of all earthly kings, destined to rule over all peoples. It was manifest destiny, written 3,000 years before America invented the term. It was the divine right of kings taken to its most extreme, most absolute conclusion. And they meant every word. This wasn't propaganda for external consumption. This was their genuine worldview, the lens through which they interpreted every action and every conquest. King Adad-nirari I put this ideology into brutal practice. He took advantage of continued internal strife within Mitanni, the kingdom that had once occupied Assyria and kept it weak, and launched a devastating military campaign. He crushed their armies, annexed a significant portion of their territory, and forced the Mitanni king Shatuara I to acknowledge himself as a vassal of the Assyrian ruler. The Assyrian texts describe it with a phrase that would become standard: the defeated king was made to bear the yoke of Ashur. Submission wasn't political, it was spiritual, a recognition of divine hierarchy. Adad-nirari's successor, Shalmaneser I, finished what his father started. He launched campaign after campaign against the weakened Mitanni state, conquering territory, deporting populations, and destroying resistance. Finally, he annexed what remained of the once mighty Mitanni kingdom entirely. A power that had dominated the region for 2 centuries was erased from the map, absorbed completely into the growing Assyrian Empire. Next came King Tukulti-Ninurta I, whose reign represented Assyria's first real bid for universal empire, and he came terrifyingly close to achieving it. He conquered Babylonia to the south, an act of shocking sacrilege, considering Babylon's cultural prestige and religious importance throughout Mesopotamia. He smashed the Hittite armies to the north, one of the other great powers of the Late Bronze Age. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like Assyria would unite the entire Near East under one crown, fulfilling the prophecy of universal kingship. But Tukulti-Ninurta made a fatal mistake, one that would haunt Assyrian rulers for centuries. He forgot that ideology doesn't stop palace coups. He forgot that even in a theocracy, politics still matters. His own nobles, resentful of his autocratic rule and perhaps frightened by how much power he'd concentrated, assassinated him in a conspiracy. His death triggered immediate civil war as different factions fought for control. And just as Assyria reached for universal greatness, the ground collapsed beneath it. Then something even larger happened. The entire Bronze Age collapsed. The rise and fall of Tukulti-Ninurta is just the beginning of this incredible story. If you want to see how Assyria rebuilt itself from the ashes into something even more terrifying, smash that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us share these forgotten chapters of history.
The Late Bronze Age collapse, roughly 1200 to 1150 BC, was one of history's greatest catastrophes, a civilizational apocalypse that destroyed almost every major power in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt for supremacy, vanished completely. Mycenaean Greece, the civilization of Agamemnon and Achilles, collapsed into a dark age. The sophisticated palace economies of the Levant disintegrated. International trade networks that had connected 3 continents simply ceased to exist. Literacy disappeared in some regions for centuries. Empires crumbled into warlord territories and pirate havens. Assyria survived. Barely. By the end of the 10th century BC, their territory had shrunk dramatically to a small core region along the middle Tigris River, basically just the heartland and immediate surroundings. Everything else was lost. But they survived. And in the ancient world, survival meant opportunity. Because while everyone else was still picking through the rubble, Assyria could rebuild with purpose.
Under King Ashur-Nasir-Pal II and his successors, Assyria began military campaigns again with systematic determination. At first, these were genuinely defensive operations, pushing back Arameo raiders who had settled in former Assyrian territory, repelling Nairi tribes from the Armenian highlands who launched regular attacks, and defending against Medes from the Iranian plateau who saw Assyria's weakness as invitation. But defense has a way of morphing into offense when you're good at it, and the Assyrians were very, very good at it. What made them so effective? Innovation. Relentless, practical, unglamorous innovation in the technology and organization of violence. The Assyrians pioneered military developments that wouldn't be matched for centuries. They created the first true cavalry units in the Near East, not just nobles riding horses for transportation, but dedicated mounted warriors who fought from horseback. Initially, these were mounted archers who could strike with devastating speed and retreat before infantry could respond. Later, they developed heavy shock cavalry, armored warriors on armored horses who could smash through infantry formations, the direct ancestors of medieval knights and cataphracts. But their real genius, the innovation that changed siege warfare forever, was engineering. Before Assyria, most armies besieged cities using the only strategy available: surround them, cut off supplies, and wait for starvation to do the work. This could take months or years. Cities with good wells and stored grain could hold out indefinitely. It was slow, expensive, and uncertain. The Assyrians asked a revolutionary question: what if we just go through the walls? They invented and perfected the battering ram, massive wooden beams tipped with bronze or iron, mounted on wheeled platforms that could be pushed up to city gates and walls. Since most Bronze Age and Iron Age cities had fortifications built from sun-dried mud brick, these rams were devastatingly effective. A wall that would take years to starve out could be breached in hours. They built siege towers, mobile wooden structures as tall as city walls, allowing archers to fire down into cities from above, and provided protected platforms for assault teams to climb onto the walls. They dug tunnels under walls to collapse them from below, a technique called mining that would be standard practice until gunpowder made walls obsolete. Suddenly, no city was safe. No walls were thick enough or high enough. No fortification could guarantee protection. Surrender became the only rational option for most defenders. The Assyrians had fundamentally changed the equation of ancient warfare. And then there was the administrative innovation that made empire actually possible: the postal system. This sounds boring until you realize what it meant. For the first time in history, an empire could maintain centralized control over distant provinces separated by hundreds of miles. Previous empires could conquer territory, but they couldn't hold it. Local rulers would just stop paying tribute as soon as the army marched away. Communication was too slow, control too tenuous. The Assyrians changed this completely. They stationed permanent garrisons in conquered cities. They appointed governors who reported directly to the king, and they monitored these governors through constant written reports delivered by mounted couriers riding relay systems. A message from the Syrian provinces could reach Nineveh in days, not months. Rebellion could be detected and crushed before it spread. To support this system, they built infrastructure, paved roads connecting every corner of the empire. These weren't built for commerce, though merchants certainly used them. They were military roads, strategic assets designed to move armies quickly and keep information flowing. The Persian royal road, the Roman road network, they all descended from this Assyrian innovation. But all of this, the professional army, the siege equipment, the infrastructure, the postal system, the bureaucracy, required staggering resources. Enormous, continuous resources. And the Assyrians had a fundamental problem. They had no formal tax system capable of supporting all this. The economy was still largely based on agriculture and local trade, neither of which generated the surplus needed for permanent military infrastructure. So they found a different solution, one that would define them for centuries. They made warfare continuous and extractive. War became the empire's economic engine. They instituted the practice of conducting annual military campaigns. Every spring, as soon as the weather allowed, the army would march out. Every autumn, it would return. The purpose wasn't always territorial expansion, though that happened. The primary purpose was extraction, loot, slaves, livestock, tribute, precious metals. War fed the empire, and the empire existed to make war. And to ensure maximum profit with minimum resistance, to make these annual campaigns as efficient as possible, the Assyrians perfected something genuinely new in human history: the systematic weaponization of terror as state policy. King Ashur-nasirpal II is where Assyrian history gets genuinely dark, where they cross a line that even other ancient societies found shocking. After capturing a city, Ashur-nasirpal would order mass executions specifically designed to traumatize anyone who heard about them, and he was proud of it. His own royal inscriptions, carved in stone and placed in his palace for visitors to read, brag about atrocities in explicit detail. I took the city and slew many warriors. I seized all that could be taken. I cut off the heads of the fighters and raised before the city a tower of skulls and bodies. A tower of the living I built. The young men I impaled upon stakes around the city, and the maidens I cast into the flames. Thus did I make known the might of my hand and the terror of my rule. This wasn't battlefield rage or soldiers out of control. This was calculated policy executed with bureaucratic thoroughness. Impalement, slowly dying over days on wooden stakes. Flaying, skin removed while victims were still alive. Dismemberment, mass burnings, crucifixion, drowning, burial alive. These weren't anomalies. These were standard operating procedures, repeated in city after city, year after year. This is where Assyria's story takes its darkest turn. But if you're still with me, understanding this brutal history, hit that like button and comment below where you're watching from. Let's build a community of people who aren't afraid of history's hardest truths. Here's the twisted logic behind Ashur-nasirpal II's atrocities. And it's important to understand this. He wasn't simply a sadist. He may have been one. We can't psychoanalyze someone dead for 2,800 years. But that's not the point. The terror was calculated, strategic, instrumental. If you make an example horrifying enough, if you ensure that every survivor tells stories that freeze blood and haunt dreams, then the next 10 cities surrender without a fight. You save Assyrian lives, you save resources, you win wars without fighting them. And for a while, it worked brilliantly. King Shalmaneser III, Ashur-nasirpal's successor, recorded numerous conquests where entire kingdoms submitted purely out of fear, having heard what happened to those who resisted. One of his inscriptions describes a typical bloodless victory. The panic-stricken terror which my lord Ashur sent upon them seized the dwellers of the city. When with my host I came before their walls, the king of the city grasped my feet and submitted to me. I accepted him and granted him life. The heavy yoke of my dominion I placed upon him for all eternity. His own sons, his kin, and his household I took as hostages to ensure his obedience forevermore. No battle, no siege, no Assyrian casualties. Just the reputation of Assyrian brutality doing the psychological work. In the short term, from a purely tactical perspective, it was brilliant. Cost-effective conquest through weaponized reputation. The mere approach of Assyrian armies could trigger mass surrenders. But here's what they didn't understand, what no empire built on terror has ever understood. Fear and hatred are not the same thing, and while fear can be managed, hatred compounds. In the long run,
The policy of systematic atrocity backfired so spectacularly that it ultimately destroyed them. Every people the Assyrians terrorized didn't just fear them, they loathed them with an intensity that transcended generations. This wasn't political opposition or strategic rivalry. This was visceral, civilization-wide hatred rooted in unbearable trauma. And even when later Assyrian kings significantly reduced the atrocities, when they tried to rule more moderately and build legitimacy through other means, the reputation stuck like blood that won't wash off. You can't unflay a population. You can't unimpale a city's sons in front of their parents and expect forgiveness. The memory persisted, transmitted parent to child, embedding itself in cultural identity. The goal of terror had been to crush any will to resist, to make rebellion unthinkable through demonstrated consequences. But over time, it produced exactly the opposite effect. The hatred became so intense that it overrode survival instinct. As soon as Assyria showed any sign of internal weakness, any crack in the facade of invincibility, multiple peoples rose up simultaneously, willing to risk annihilation for a chance at revenge. In the north, peoples who had suffered under Assyrian campaigns united to form a new state, specifically designed as an anti-Assyrian power. Urartu, centered around Lake Van, became Assyria's persistent rival. In the west, Aramean tribes that had been scattered and fragmented came together in two powerful military confederations, their unity forged by shared hatred of Assyria. In Babylonia to the south, rebellions erupted constantly despite heavy Assyrian garrisons, because Babylonians would rather die fighting than live under Assyrian rule.
And here's the fundamental unsustainability of the system. Perpetual war as an economic model has a terminal flaw. The Assyrians were caught in a vicious cycle they couldn't escape. They needed continuous loot to fund the professional army and bureaucracy. The army's primary job was to acquire more loot through annual campaigns. But the more territory they conquered, the more territory they had to garrison with expensive troops. The more peoples they brutalized, the more rebellions they had to suppress with costly military expeditions. The more resources they extracted, the less value the conquered territories retained. Think about what happens to a region after an Assyrian campaign. The city walls are demolished, the population is partially killed, partially enslaved, and partially deported. The agricultural infrastructure is damaged or destroyed. Trade collapses because merchants don't operate in active war zones. The land that was supposed to generate wealth for the empire instead becomes a resource drain, requiring garrison costs while producing little revenue. Provincial governors commanding their own military forces in distant regions began slipping out of central control. They started ignoring orders from Nineveh when it suited them. Some began intervening directly in succession disputes and power struggles within the capital itself, using their armies as political leverage. The empire was fragmenting even as it expanded. By the end of the 9th century BC, the system had collapsed. Constant warfare and endemic civil unrest had pushed Syria into economic ruin. The conquered territories fell away one by one, either through successful rebellion or through simple neglect, as Assyria lacked resources to maintain control. King Shamshi-Adad V, theoretically ruler of an empire, actually ruled little more than the capital city of Nineveh and a small patch of surrounding territory. The empire had imploded. Assyria was on the verge of total collapse, possibly complete extinction. Then, in 745 BC, everything changed. A military officer named Tiglath-Pileser led a coup, seized the throne, and implemented reforms so comprehensive and effective that they didn't just save Assyria, they transformed it into something more powerful and more sustainable than ever before. His first reform targeted the military structure itself. The old system had relied primarily on a militia of free citizens, landowners who were obligated to serve in campaigns and who supplied their own weapons and armor. This was cheap but ineffective, poorly trained, inconsistently equipped, and available only seasonally since they needed to tend their farms. Tiglath-Pileser III created the world's first truly professional standing army.
He began recruiting impoverished peasants who had no land and no other prospects, paying them regular wages, equipping them entirely at state expense with standardized weapons and armor, and training them year-round in dedicated military camps. He introduced strict discipline and a formal command hierarchy. He reorganized the entire army into specialized units, chariot corps, cavalry squadrons, light infantry, heavy infantry, and engineering corps, each trained for specific tactical roles. The result was an army that was faster, more skilled, better equipped, and more disciplined than any military force in the ancient world. And it was available for campaigns year-round, not just during agricultural off-seasons. But a professional army requires professional funding. So Tiglath-Pileser carried out comprehensive tax and administrative reforms. First, he imposed new direct taxes on farmers and craftsmen throughout Assyrian territory, actual systematic taxation rather than irregular tribute. Second, and more importantly, he reformed provincial administration to prevent governors from becoming independent warlords. He did this through a brilliant but ruthless tactic. He reduced the size of individual provinces while dramatically increasing their total number. Smaller provinces meant less power for any individual governor. Then, crucially, he began appointing eunuchs as provincial governors. Why eunuchs? Because they couldn't have biological children. They couldn't establish dynasties. They had no sons who might inherit a province and declare independence. They posed no dynastic threat to central authority. Their entire status and wealth depended on royal favor, making them far more reliably loyal than governors with family ambitions. With a reformed professional army and a centralized, stable administrative state, Tiglath-Pileser III was ready to launch a new wave of conquests. But this time, Assyria's approach to conquered peoples would take a dramatic turn. Tiglath-Pileser III just saved Assyria from total collapse, but his most controversial policy is coming next. Drop a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Let's keep building this community of history enthusiasts.
Tiglath-Pileser III didn't just rebuild Assyria, he revolutionized the entire concept of imperial administration, and he did it through a policy so extreme, so comprehensive in its social engineering that it would fundamentally reshape the ethnic and linguistic map of the entire Near East. The Assyrians called it nasahu, meaning uprooting or displacement. We would call it forced mass deportation. Here's how it worked, and the scale is almost incomprehensible. After conquering a region, Assyrian administrators would deport nearly the entire population, sometimes tens of thousands of people, to a completely different part of the empire, often hundreds of miles away. In their place, they would resettle captives from other conquered regions, creating a demographic patchwork where everyone was a stranger in a strange land. The strategic logic was devastatingly effective. You can't rebel to liberate your homeland if you're 1,000 miles away from it, resettled in unfamiliar territory among people who don't speak your language. You can't organize coordinated resistance if you're surrounded by strangers from a dozen different ethnic groups who have no shared identity or common cause. The policy was designed to sever the connection between people and place, to erase national identities, and to assimilate diverse populations into a homogeneous Assyrian imperial identity. It was cultural genocide by relocation, executed with bureaucratic efficiency across generations. And in terms of destroying resistance movements, it worked extraordinarily well. Rebellion rates in provinces subjected to nasahu dropped dramatically compared to earlier periods. But there were unintended consequences that the Assyrians never anticipated. The most significant was the spread of Aramaean culture and language throughout the empire. Aramaeans had been among the most frequently deported peoples, scattered across every region of Assyrian territory, and their language, Aramaic, was simpler and more accessible than Akkadian, the traditional language of Mesopotamia. It used an alphabetic script rather than cuneiform, making it easier to learn and write. Over time, Aramaic became the lingua franca of the entire Near East, not just in conquered territories, but in Assyria's own heartland. Even ethnic Assyrians began speaking Aramaic more commonly than their ancestral Akkadian in daily life. Official scribes began keeping administrative records in both languages. In relief carvings from later periods, you can see scribes working in pairs, one writing in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets, the other writing in Aramaic on papyrus. The empire was gradually assimilating the culture of its conquered peoples, even as it destroyed their political independence. Still, the Nasahu policy combined with Tiglath-Pileser's reforms proved extraordinarily effective at enabling rapid expansion. In 745 BC, Tiglath-Pileser aided Babylonian king Nabu-Nasir in his struggle against Chaldean tribes and the kingdom of Elam to the east. As a result, Nabu-Nasir became an Assyrian vassal, and Tiglath-Pileser adopted the prestigious title King of Sumer and Akkad, essentially claiming supremacy over all of Mesopotamian civilization. He then led a campaign eastward onto the Iranian plateau and subdued the Median tribes living there, establishing Assyrian authority over peoples who had never before acknowledged any foreign power. Having tested his reformed army in real combat against various enemies, Tiglath-Pileser felt confident enough to tackle the greatest challenge, Urartu, Assyria's primary rival. Urartu at this time was ruled by King Sarduri II and had formed a powerful military alliance with several Hurrian states and Aramaean tribal confederations. Together, they represented the most formidable opposition Assyria had faced in generations. This would be the ultimate test of whether Tiglath-Pileser's reforms had actually worked.
In 743 BC, the decisive Battle of Arpad took place in northern Syria, where Assyrian forces faced off against the combined armies of Urartu and its allies. The Assyrian victory was so overwhelming, so complete and conclusive, that the psychological impact rippled across the entire region. Many kingdoms in Syria and the Levant immediately submitted to Assyrian rule without any resistance whatsoever and paid tribute to avoid the fate of those who had opposed Tiglath-Pileser. In 735 BC, Tiglath-Pileser delivered what should have been a death blow to Urartu itself. He led his army in an audacious campaign all the way to Tushpa, the enemy capital spectacularly located on the shores of Lake Van. The Assyrians managed to breach the city's outer defenses and destroyed the lower city in a display of military prowess, but the citadel itself, perched atop a sheer mock face, naturally fortified by geography, remained impregnable despite Assyrian siege technology. Although the kingdom of Urartu technically survived as a political entity, the campaign triggered a period of profound internal crisis. For many years afterward, Urartu was essentially paralyzed, incapable of challenging Assyrian dominance in any meaningful way. In 732 BC, Tiglath-Pileser launched another massive campaign into the Levant. He conquered Damascus, ending its independence. The wealthy Phoenician city-states, seeing what had happened to those who resisted, acknowledged Assyrian supremacy and paid massive tributes to avoid destruction. The sums were staggering. Tyre alone paid 150 talents of gold, approximately 4.5 tons, along with enormous quantities of silver and other precious materials. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah were transformed into client states, maintaining nominal independence but paying regular tribute and acknowledging Assyrian overlordship. The campaign reached all the way to the border of Egypt itself, ending with the capture of Ashkelon, capital of the Philistines. Tiglath-Pileser had brought Assyrian power to the doorstep of the ancient world's other great civilization. The following year, he returned to Babylonia, where Chaldean tribes had resumed their resistance. In a brutal campaign, he defeated the Chaldean coalition and took an astonishing 154,000 prisoners, a number that gives you some sense of the scale of Nasahu deportations. These captives would be scattered across the empire, their homelands repopulated with deportees from other regions. Then, in 729 BC, Tiglath-Pileser did something that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. He crowned himself King of Babylon, officially uniting Assyria and Babylonia under a single monarch. This was more than political conquest. It was a claim to the cultural and religious legacy of Mesopotamia's most prestigious civilization. In just 15 years, Tiglath-pileser III had brought the entire Near East under Assyrian control, from Lake Van in the north to the borders of Egypt in the south, from the Persian Gulf in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. This was the birth of what historians call the neo-Assyrian Empire, and it was more powerful, more organized, and more extensive than anything that had come before. And his successors would push even further. Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Esarhaddon continued the expansionist policy with relentless determination. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent in the early 7th century BC under these rulers. Egypt, the ancient rival, was finally invaded and conquered. Elam, Assyria's persistent enemy to the east, was crushed decisively. The island of Cyprus, controlling crucial Mediterranean trade routes, submitted to Assyrian authority. Rebellious Phoenician cities that had tried to assert independence were subjugated again. Urartu was pushed far into the northern mountains, reduced to a shadow of its former power. In the west, Assyrian armies seized vast territories in Anatolia, reaching regions no Mesopotamian power had ever controlled. In 618 BC, during yet another Babylonian rebellion, the city seemed incapable of accepting Assyrian rule permanently. King Sennacherib did something that shocked even his own people. He utterly destroyed Babylon. Not conquered it, not occupied it, not plundered it, destroyed it. He tore down every building, demolished the temples, deported the entire population, relocated the city's divine statues to Nineveh, and then flooded the ruins with water from the Euphrates River, literally trying to erase the city from existence. It was an act of such extreme sacrilege. Babylon was one of the holiest cities in Mesopotamian civilization, home to Marduk himself, that even Assyrians were horrified. His own son and successor, Esarhaddon, felt compelled to rebuild the city to appease both the gods and the Babylonian population, whose support was necessary for stability. Under Esarhaddon, who reigned from 681 to 629 BC, the empire reached its absolute peak. The authority of the Assyrian king seemed unlimited, his power unquestionable. All the peoples of the Near East had bowed before Assyrian might. The empire stretched from the highlands of Anatolia to the deserts of Egypt, from the mountains of Persia to the islands of the Mediterranean. No force on earth appeared capable of challenging it. It was hard to imagine, standing in that moment of supreme power, that within just 1 century, within the lifetime of children already born, not a single trace of mighty Assyria would remain except ruins buried in sand and monuments toppled by vengeful enemies. But that's exactly what was about to happen. And it started with a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. We're approaching the shocking, rapid collapse of the world's first superpower. If this epic story has you completely gripped, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Your engagement helps us reach more history lovers like you.
Here's what makes this even more remarkable. Assyrian counterintelligence actually uncovered evidence of the plot. Clay tablets discovered in Ashurnapal's royal archive at Nineveh contain detailed reports from agents describing Shamash-shum-ukin's suspicious diplomatic activities, noting unusual movements of messengers, documenting secret meetings. The intelligence was good, specific, actionable. Yet the reports were apparently ignored or dismissed. Perhaps Ashurnapal couldn't believe his own brother would betray him. Perhaps he underestimated the threat. Perhaps palace politics prevented proper action. Whatever the reason, no preventive measures were taken. In the spring of 652 BC, Shamash-shum-ukin openly rebelled, declaring Babylonian independence and calling on his coalition partners to rise simultaneously against Assyria. It should have been the end of the empire. The forces arrayed against Assyria were enormous, geographically dispersed, and highly motivated. But the coalition failed spectacularly to coordinate. Egypt provided essentially no military support despite promises. Lydia, suddenly under attack from Cimmerian invasions, immediately withdrew from the alliance to deal with its own crisis. The remaining allies, Elamites, Chaldeans, Medes, Persians, Arabs, acted without strategic coordination, launching uncoordinated attacks that allowed Assyria to defeat them piecemeal using classic divide-and-conquer tactics. Assyrian generals, commanding that professional reformed military inherited from Tiglath-pileser III, systematically crushed the rebel forces one by one over a 4-year campaign. By the autumn of 648 BC, they had Babylon itself under siege. Rather than surrender and face his brother's judgment, Shamash-shum-ukin committed suicide along with his wife and closest supporters, choosing death over captivity. The Assyrians unleashed terrible, systematic vengeance on Babylon and throughout the rebellious territories. Captured rebels had their tongues ripped out, their limbs hacked off. Mutilated bodies were left in public squares to be devoured by dogs and pigs. The message was clear: this is what rebellion costs. After Babylon fell, Assyrian armies moved swiftly to suppress the Chaldeans in the south, to invade what remained of Elam and destroy it as a political entity once and for all, and to punish the Arab tribes who had supported the rebellion. Ashurnapal celebrated his stunning victory with a brutal display designed to humiliate defeated enemies absolutely. As he entered the temple of Ishtar in Nineveh in triumphal procession, his chariot was pulled not by horses, but by 5 defeated kings, harnessed like animals, crawling on their hands and knees. Behind him walked the closest allies of Shamash-shum-ukin, each forced to wear around their neck the severed head of a rebellious prince like a grotesque trophy. Assyria had reached the absolute apex of its power. Every enemy had been defeated. Every rebellion had been crushed. The military machine appeared invincible. No force on earth seemed capable of standing against it. But appearances deceived. In reality, Assyria was bleeding out internally. The constant uprisings and the massive military campaigns required to suppress them had drained the empire's strength catastrophically. The Medes on the Iranian plateau never returned to Assyrian control, too distant, too costly to reconquer. Egypt, emboldened by Assyria's distraction, broke away and re-established independence. Lydia, dealing with its own Cimmerian crisis, simply stopped acknowledging Ashurnapal's authority. And Ashurnapal no longer had the military resources or economic strength to force them back. The empire was overstretched, exhausted, financially strained to the breaking point.
Then came a new threat that Assyria was completely unprepared for: the Cimmerians. These were nomadic warriors from the Eurasian steppes, following in the destructive wake of the Scythians, appearing along Assyrian borders in growing numbers during the 630s BC. Under their leader Medes, they invaded Assyrian territory in force. Assyria, weakened by decades of continuous warfare and internal rebellions, was in no condition to resist effectively. The Cimmerians weren't trying to conquer territory in the traditional sense. They were raiding, plundering, and moving on. They swept across the western parts of the empire like a devastating tidal wave, rolling westward beyond the Euphrates, leaving destruction in their wake. This sudden catastrophe broke something fundamental in the Assyrian state. It shattered confidence, exposed weakness, and plunged the empire into chaos and lethal internal strife. Ashurbanipal lost the trust and support of his military elite, the generals and provincial governors who actually commanded the armies. He was removed from power in a coup, left with only nominal control over Babylonia. When Ashurbanipal died in 627 BC, the floodgates opened. A vicious civil war erupted between his sons and various generals, each claiming legitimate authority. The empire didn't gradually decline, it collapsed with shocking speed. One by one, Assyrian provinces declared independence or were simply abandoned as the central government lost the ability to project power. In Babylon, a Chaldean prince named Nabopolassar seized power, declared independence from Assyria, and launched an aggressive war of liberation to free all of Babylonia from Assyrian control. By 619 BC, he had completely succeeded. Babylonia was independent, unified, and increasingly powerful. Meanwhile, Egypt re-entered the regional power game, occupying Canaan, the Levant, and Syria, regions that had been left essentially leaderless after the Cimmerian invasions. The Assyrians completely lacked the strength to confront this resurgent Babylonian power or to challenge Egyptian expansion. In a desperate final move, Assyrian king Sin-shar-ishkun attempted to form one last anti-Babylonian coalition. He allied with Urartu, Mannai, and even Egypt, former enemies now united by fear of Babylon. But it was far too late. The coalition was weak, poorly coordinated, and lacked genuine commitment. Nabopolassar defeated the combined armies decisively. Around the same time, the Median king Cyaxares, ruling a now unified Median kingdom on the Iranian plateau, invaded Assyria from the east. Both armies, Babylonian from the south, Median from the east, raced toward Assyrian heartland. The Medes arrived first at the city of Ashur, the ancient capital, the spiritual heart of the empire. They stormed the city and burned it completely to the ground, destroying temples, palaces, and walls. On the flaming ruins of Ashur, Cyaxares and Nabopolassar sealed a formal military alliance against their common enemy. In 612 BC, the combined Babylonian-Median army laid siege to Nineveh itself, the great capital that had stood for centuries as the center of the world's most powerful empire. The siege lasted 3 brutal months. Finally, the city's defenses were breached. King Sin-shar-ishkun died during the final assault, likely by his own hand to avoid capture. The city was systematically looted and then burned. The remnants of the Assyrian army, still supported by Egyptian forces hoping to maintain a buffer state, regrouped in the city of Haran in northern Mesopotamia. The last king of Assyria, Ashur-uballit II, attempted desperately to rally what was left of the empire, to somehow resurrect Assyrian power from the ashes. But his efforts were futile, his resources non-existent, his cause hopeless. In 610 BC, the Medes captured Haran. The following year, 609 BC, Nabopolassar's forces crushed the final combined Assyrian-Egyptian army in the region at the Battle of Carchemish. And with that, the story of the Assyrian Empire, the world's first true empire, the civilization that had pioneered so many technologies of power and control, the state that had dominated the Near East for 3 centuries, came to an absolute end. The victors were thorough. They burned Assyrian cities so completely that within a single generation, people forgot where Nineveh had even stood. The great capital became a grass-covered mound. Travelers would pass by and not know they were walking over the ruins of history's first superpower. The Assyrians had built an empire on systematic terror, on the weaponization of fear. They had perfected conquest and pioneered administration. They had created innovations in military technology, infrastructure, and governance that every subsequent empire would copy. But when their empire finally fell, when the cities burned and the last king died, no one mourned. No allies came to their aid. No subjects fought to preserve Assyrian rule. The hatred they had sown for 3 centuries came due all at once. And the lesson? An empire built on fear can dominate the world, but it cannot last, because fear breeds hatred, and hatred, given time and opportunity, always finds its revenge. That's the complete rise and catastrophic fall of Assyria, the world's first empire, and a cautionary tale that echoes through history. If this epic story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest civilizations, and comment below where you're watching from. Building this community means everything, and your support helps us share these incredible stories with history lovers around the world. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.